Dmitry or Dima Adamsky's Russian Nuclear Orthodoxy: Religion, Politics, and Strategy. When examining the history and era of monarchies, empires, and theocracies, there's a common misconception that the state and the church operated in unison with one another. What's often overlooked is that there were often conflicts. For example, King Henry VIII argued for the right to have a divorce. While his Anglican theology was more complicated than that, he invoked Caesar papism, the divorce was still a point of contention. Earlier in England, Henry II demanded that the king possess church property. This sparked the martyrdom of Thomas Becket. And in Russia, Peter the Great abolished the church's patriarch and replaced it with a state-managed church synod. Peter the Great didn't really like the church all that much. So you have this trend with the state arguing with the church. Now, I give these examples to show that there was a conflict between the two. This conflict often meant a separation of sorts. However, unlike the modern cliche interpretation of the First Amendment, where they say the government is protection from religious influence, the separation was actually meant as a form of reverence. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar, and give unto God what is God's. This meant that for the most part the state had no authority in declaring the church's doctrinal issues, and from this point it was on the conscience of the monarchy whether or not they complied with church teaching. Often for political reasons, the state felt the need to embrace confessionalism, even if its own laws contradicted church teaching. For example, Spain was a Catholic country, but Spain also owned slaves, despite the church's condemnation of such by Pope Eugene IV in his bull Sicut Dudum in 1435. What we have today in Russia is a bit different. It's different from the modern American libertine approach to religion, where religion is considered a private affair. There's absolutely nothing private about the Russian Orthodox Church ceremonially blessing military equipment and endorsing an unjust war. And on the flip side, the Russian Orthodox Church does not really serve as a conscience for the Russian state as they say the Pope does for Catholics, or the Church did for the medieval state. Rather, the Church in Russia serves as a legitimizer of the Russian Federation's strategy and policy, and this is the subject of Dmitry Adamsky's Russian Nuclear Orthodoxy. Now, this book was written in 2019. In 2019, Russia had already invaded Crimea and the Donbass and unsuccessfully attempted to instigate coups in parts of Kharkiv and Odessa. In 2019, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine was granted autocephaly by Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, the Patriarch of Constantinople. And so what this meant was that Ukraine had a church that was recognized by the majority of Orthodox Christians as independent from the direct governance of the Russian Orthodox Church. In 2019, Russia had not yet attempted its full-scale invasion, but Russia had plenty of conflict with Ukraine. So this book is written in the midst of a war, even though it's not the war we're currently discussing. In Dmitry Adamsky's book, he discusses three phases of modern history with the Russian Orthodox Church. The first accounts for the 90s and the post-Soviet era. In this section, he recounts Russia's decision to revitalize its nuclear program. This period is something of an outreach to expand their program, where they're just getting their seeds in the ground, so to speak. The other two sections speak of the consecutive decades. In the 2000s, there was an official churching of the military where they started placing church officials in the military in different areas. And in 2010, this became something of an official declaration where military functions and church functions coincide with one another. In a very strange way, the Russian Orthodox clergy, including the Russian Patriarch Alexei, were present offering prayers and words of endorsement for Russia's nuclear program. This is going back to the 90s. What the Russian Orthodox Church was justifying was a revitalization of the Soviet nuclear program while also granting it a spiritual legitimacy. It did this using some rather interesting historical revisions of the USSR. Because the Soviet holiday for nuclear scientists fell on the feast of St. Seraphim of Sarov, and because his monastery in Sarov was the first Soviet testing site for the nuclear weapons, and because his Akathist prayer mentions him as a protector of Russia, Russians now speak of Seraphim Sarov as though he had approved and sanctified the nuclear program. Even though the Soviets initially built the testing site in order to desecrate his monastery. This is not unique either. Each nuclear triad in Russia's military has its own particular saint. Now, compare this to the Catholic Church, or to Pope John Paul XXIII's letter Pacem in Terris, or compare this to Paul VI's plea to the UN, where he called for nuclear deproliferation. And while Pope St. John Paul II did write a letter to the UN defending the usage of nuclear weapons, he was defending it as a deterrence. Deproliferation remained the goal for JP2 as well. So, even though the Catholic Church has embraced just war doctrine and has embraced a deproliferation of nuclear weapons, and even though it allows some nuclear weapons, its ultimate goal is always peace, and it tries to eradicate nuclear weapons. But the general concept of nuclear orthodoxy, or nuclear East Russian Orthodoxy, is that the state must be nuclear in order to defend the Orthodox religion, and it must also be devoutly Orthodox in order to maintain its nuclear status. Coming from a former atheistic country, this is a very strange claim. And there are more examples of this. Adamsky recounts a narrative written by Vasil Svets in a book called Russia Before the Second Coming. Here Svets claims that it was a desperate Stalin and a particular Soviet officials and their devotion to religious icons that allowed the USSR to turn around the results in the Second World War. The historical claims are a bit dubious given that Stalin was obviously anti-Christian to his core, but these sorts of beliefs seem common in Russian society, where there are stories of Stalin having some kind of spiritual guidance. While as a religious individual I can appreciate the presence of Christian iconography, I'm not sure I appreciate it being used to legitimize the actions of the Russian military. It is appropriate for all militaries to commemorate their soldiers, and the use of saints seems good, but it hurts me to say that people wearing medals representing saints are also the same people that deserve to be unalived on the battlefield. In some cases, these same individuals may be using sexual violence and torture as a weapon while wearing religious imagery, just as they did in Irpin and Bucha. While I can appreciate the fact that Russians may be devoted to certain saints, putting an iconography in such a context is a problem. Simply because there is religious imagery present doesn't mean one is actually adhering to religious values. In the case of the Russian Orthodox Church, it's also worth noting that their leaders had ties to the KGB, so their church in an official manner endorsed an abuse of the Christian religion. We see this today where the Russian Orthodox Church still won't apologize for when the KGB forced the conversion of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And this still seems to be the case. When Russia first initiated the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, Patriarch Kirill argued that those who fought in the conflict would die a martyr's death. This was him applying the concept of a holy war to a war that was in the Russia's military and imperial interest, but not a war that's necessarily in their spiritual interest, thus making Patriarch Kirill much more of a spokesperson for the Kremlin than his own church. Now, the way this issue affects Ukraine is quite obvious. Russia believes that Ukrainians are really Russians, so the churches that are affiliated with the Moscow Patriarch support a kind of unity with the Kremlin. Indeed, this is the premise behind Ruski Mir ideology, that Russia can speak for Russians anywhere and can apparently claim others as Russian. Of course, this is what Putin had done with Ukraine, but the following quote from Kirill shows this sentiment as well. Quote, "What happens if the father and the son swear allegiance to different states? God forbid they try to resolve these differences with arms." End quote. Yes. God forbid that's what happens. Anyway, thank you.